As many of you probably know, I like the original Diablo games, and I also happen to enjoy dipping into Bullet Heavens from time to time, since they've both got a cathartic energy to keep me engaged while listening to things like podcasts. Pretty much the same way I play Diablo 2 most of the time as well these days. So when I saw that there was a Diablo-inspired Bullet Heaven, I jumped at it and was extremely hopeful. And needless to say, unlike some recent excursions back into Bullet Heavens, Halls of Torment hit that spot quite well, with a nice mix of characters, enjoyable attack patterns and controls for each of them, and an interesting, albeit still limited variety of additional skills to give you a nice mix of tools in your runs. Oh, and did I mention there's a loot system that is part of the meta progression? All this in spite of still being early access. Now, there are a lot of things I like about this, as you can probably tell by that intro, and I haven't even gotten into all of them, but I do need to point out that there is one thing lacking, and this may or may not be an issue for you as a player, and that is, there is no snowballing in it currently, or simply put, I've found no way to really become an overpowered wrecking ball like you see in high-level Vampire Survivors or even roguelites in general. Instead, this relies much more on positioning and planning, and while there are cool ways to modify each build, I've yet to find a combo that makes me say, yep, this is broken. But if you can leave that aside and not be bothered by the fact that you actually have to consider your setup instead of going for the current meta overpowered build every single time, there's a lot here to like, especially since it checks all the important boxes with reasonable run lengths, interesting meta progression and enemy design, and each of the characters have their own unique feel while still maintaining build flexibility. The way they maintain this unique feel for each of the classes is pretty much the ideal situation for me. You of course have generic abilities you can find while playing like orbitals, spikes, flame waves, etc., but you also have a core ability for each class that's unique to it alone, such as slashing attacks for the warrior, a longer range but lower damage multi-shot bow attack for the archer, and even a flamethrower for things like the exterminator, with each of these primary attacks having different special modifiers you get as upgrades by just leveling up during the run. And these function slightly different than other Bullet Heavens in that you can actually aim and use these manually with your mouse if you want to, or you can set them up to auto-fire where you're aiming, or if you're really needing it, you can actually turn on a full-blown auto-aim that just causes them to target enemies on their own, like most of the global special abilities. This means that you'll end up playing a little bit into each of these skills on the character, but you'll also want to track down special generic skills to cover the gaps. And once you've unlocked these global skills on that run, you will start to have the option to upgrade them and modify them as you would your main skill, with each of them having a unique upgrade path that stacks with your global boosts. Though the amount of skills you get per run are admittedly fairly limited, since to unlock it, you have to pick up scrolls, which only drop from certain bosses and specific spawn locations on the map. The other upgrade you'll get, which has a much more far-reaching impact due to meta progression, is equipment. These come from chests, which are equally as limited as scrolls, dropping from specific bosses as well, and spawning on the map too. The thing is, equipment actually has an unlocking mechanic that lets you unlock it for use across multiple runs through what is called the Well. Simply put, you rescue an NPC that stands by a well and lets you export one item out of the dungeon each run by placing it in said well, and then you can use your meta progression currency to unlock that item and start using it as equipment for future runs. Once you unlock an item, don't worry, it's yours to keep forever, even if it is consumable like the Resurrection Ring, and you won't lose it if you die. So sending items up the well each run will be an important thing that you want to do, even if you don't have the gold at the time to unlock them when you get back to town, since you can save up for it and you'll eventually be going into the dungeon each time fully equipped. Now, that's far from the only meta progression though. In fact, it's even the result of another form of progression called quests, or basically achievements you pursue to unlock items and skills so they can drop in the future, and even unlocking upgrade paths for you to spend your currency on in the form of blessings. Most of these quests are goals such as reaching a certain level on a map or surviving a certain amount of time, doing specific types of damage, or even killing certain amounts of enemies, some of them being character specific or even map specific, others just being done in general. Now personally, I particularly liked the Exterminator, so I got a lot of his tree unlocked, which means I got a lot of fire themes unlocked. But if you do it with, say, the Archer, you'll get crit and attack speed based unlocks, the Warrior gets you blade themed ones, among other things. This really does incentivize you to play a variety of styles, since playing a style will unlock things that make that method stronger in the future and also give buffs to the other builds, while not inhibiting you on your first run because the first run is still completely possible to do. The last form of meta progression, at least currently, is the blessing system, or basically what you're probably more familiar with meta progression. It's a system that provides boosts to damage, range, etc. in exchange for currency. It's freely able to be reset, and by doing quests, you'll unlock abilities on the blessing tree that will help in future runs, so you unlock more of them as you go. Though admittedly, the fire ones are not going to be ideal if you're playing anything other than the exterminator, while the warrior and archer unlocks are a bit more useful for everyone. Now, to get all this, you of course have to face enemies, and Halls of Torment is doing something that I am glad to see more and more Bullet Heavens doing. It makes enemies interesting. Even the basic enemies that have a variety of movement and attack patterns, and even quirks, that give them much more in the way of layers than mindlessly walking towards you. I mean, admittedly, it does start with skeletons doing just that, and even the shield-bearing ones will do it too, though you have to break the shield to get to them, but you'll also run across imps that try and flank you by side-strafing, you'll have slimes that will do splits on dying, and they'll also hop sideways, or in the case of the green ones, they'll even leave puddles of poison on the ground. You have hellhounds that will spiral around the map, meaning you cannot just bulldoze straight through them, or you'll get pinged on the side. And you even have teleporting mages and various other ranged enemies that will try to get away from you to attack you from afar. This results in needing to adapt your movement and aim to the enemy you're facing at the time. It's not overwhelming usually, and if you think ahead, you can work all around all of them, and it still keeps the cathartic mowing through enemies feel, but it keeps it from being disengaging or boring, and is a lot more fun than the more mindless Bullet Heavens where you eventually just start walking in a direction as an unstoppable force. The bosses are similarly interesting. You have mid-bosses that are essentially stronger than normal enemies with a life bar that if you kill, you'll get additional scrolls and in turn additional abilities. And then you have the major bosses that drop chests but have special broadcasted attack patterns, a lot of life, and even summon allies to help them. And I think this really does help them remain memorable to me, since it becomes part of the strategy to try and take them down quickly before the next boss or tougher wave comes, since they will be controlling your movement with these special abilities. And another nice thing in all of this, while I have not done a deep dive into the mechanics to break it down, this is also one of the few Bullet Heavens where defensive functions actually feel purposeful and helpful. Defense does the usual damage reduction, but by adding a block function that has a chance to negate damage under a certain amount, and defense helping you get closer to that amount, you get much more mileage out of being able to push enemies in dire situations, while never becoming truly immune as far as I can tell. Overall, I actually find that I prefer this title even in its early access state over games like Vampire Survivors. It just feels like I have more agency as a player with a good number of systems to engage with and unique enemies, all without losing that unique and cathartic feel of Bullet Heavens that's kind of an easy approach genre in general. Sure, it could use a little more in the way of splashes of color and complexity into the level design, but the strong bones are there and I'm happy to see the core game even as it is. So do you enjoy Bullet Heavens, or do you find them just a little too laid back? Mention it down below, and if you want to see some other recent entries into the genre, I'll be sure to throw one on the screen now. And if you found this video interesting or helpful, tapping some of those buttons beneath the video before you leave help out a ton as well.